It's my great pleasure and an honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Lynn Katz from UT Austin, the Department of Civil Architectural and Environmental Engineering, where Lynn was also served as director and associate director of 2 different centers over there. Professor Katz has 30-year research experience on applying surface chemistry to feed and transport of pollutants, and also development of treatment technologies, and lately has been working on finding low quality and alternative water source and treatment for underserved communities. Professor Katz has an undergraduate from Johns Hopkins and master's and PhD from University of Michigan. She also has served as a few leadership roles in our community, AESP and ACS, highlighting her service to our community and the university as well. So we're so happy to have you here, Lynn, and
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for letting me come and talk today. And I'm going to talk about how we think about doing science, or how we've done it, and certainly how I've done it in the past 30 years of thinking how we go from molecular science to practical application. On the slide here, you see a tailing pond in Chile that I visited a number of years ago, because I'm going to talk a lot about examples associated with mining today. And so you can see the telephone pole here. This is actually a really tall telephone pole. Looks pretty short there, and you can see the berm where this tailing from the mine located up the hill over here is getting pretty high. And more recently, you see there's some work that we've been looking at Coeur d'Alene. And you can see this is when the mining was on operation, and you can see now some of the remediation that's been done. And I'll talk about this project as well that I was a part of as part of the National Academy study, as well as Bill Arnold. So Bill and I worked on this together with a number of other people. This figure on the left here is something that I started with when I first became a faculty member, and I said, well, I want a sort of vision of my research, and this was the vision I sort of created that, okay, so we work in nice controlled experiments, we test models, and if they work, great, and if they don't, then we go and do spectroscopic or microscopic data to try and understand why they're failing, and if they are failing, I think I'm stepping out of the range you told me to, sorry. I'm not really good at staying in the box. So do spectroscopic studies, we refine our models, and then we go back and we add more complexity to the system we look at, and we circle around like this. Well, recently, when I was thinking about this a lot, I was thinking it's really not that great to go into a circle because it's very egocentric, and we just keep doing the same things over and over again. So I converted this to a spiral. So you can see same kind of idea, macroscopic data to model assessment. And the reason I show you this now is because I'm going to show you this a lot as we go through the talk to sort of orient you where I think we are in this process at various points. But the key about the spiral is we can come out of it. And we can come out of it at various points based on what we know and apply that to what we do in the field. And that's sort of the approach that we take. And the other reason I'm showing this is because I'm going to show you this a lot of times. It took me like 10 hours to make this, and then getting help after I made it. So I've got to get like the payback from the effort that went into that. Now, when I started in this field, a lot of the waters I worked with were a lot like river waters or lake waters, where they had total dissolved solids of about 100 milligrams per liter and had background electrolytes or background ions that made up the composition of those waters. But as we've moved on, we have to look at much lower quality waters as we have water scarcity, and we're looking at, say, desalination, and now we're looking at seawaters that are 35,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids. And a lot of the work I do now is even actually working with oil and gas field waters, often called produced water, which can range anywhere from about a little bit less than 50,000 milligrams per liter of dissolved solids to well over 300,000. So much more complex waters as we deal, and here's a couple that are typical, and you can see the amount of chloride and sodium as well as sulfate in some of these waters as well. Okay? All right, so what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm going to focus on metals, and then contaminant absorption is the area of research that I've been involved in throughout my career. So we'll talk a little bit about contaminant absorption, we'll look at some modeling of that, and then we'll move on to this study of Lake Coeur d'Alene. This is a large study. I'm only focusing on the sediment water interface and looking at reabsorption's role in these sediments. And as I said, Scott Fendorf, Jim Mosby, Bob Hirsch, Bill, and I all worked on this section together. And then I'm going to move on talking to some more recent work with membranes and how we're using the same approach that we used when we looked at soils and sediments, and then ask what now. Oops, I forgot to tell you that this is my favorite picture of a periodic table, and we'll come back to periodic tables, but I like this because almost everything is a metal or metalloid. So everybody who's doing nutrients and PFAS, you're over here to the right. And so I'm going to start today talking about why metals and not PFAS. How many people are working on PFAS? All right. Well, that's good. So this is like the lowest number of PFAS people I've seen in the country so far, and this is my 22nd talk. So, all right. All right. So I'm going to hopefully convince you why we should be looking at metals. And so metals are not PFAS, but they actually are the forever chemicals. Okay. So I really like this quote from the National Resource Defense Council that basically says forever chemicals is what we should call them, and they show up everywhere. But the quote is, if you're wondering why they call them forever chemicals, it's because they're nearly indestructible. Well, with the exception of nuclear reactions, metals are indestructible. You can't get rid of them. And in fact, they're not only indestructible, but they move across phases. So they go from the air, as we're looking at this example of mercury, going into the water, getting converted to mercury 2 in the water, and then ending up in the sediment or in the biota, and so they create problems for us in all phases, and they transfer across phases. Metals aren't forever, but they can be sequestered. Many times they sequester where we don't want them. So this is actually looking at a 2019 study that looked at skeletal remains from the Roman Empire, which had 400 times more lead than from the Iron Age. So they used lead in aqueducts in Rome, and so a lot of people feel that was the cause of this. And sometimes people think it was the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire, but I don't think so, personally. But more recently, if we look at lead markers associated with growth in this 5-year-old child, you can see the lead markers in the x-rays, and the blood lead level for this child was 37.7 micrograms per deciliter. Anybody know what the safe level of lead is? 0, right? It's 0, but if you look on the CDC website, they'll give you a lead level of about 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, and that's just basically to say, well, you have lead higher than most children. Okay, so it's just a reference level. Metals are forever, and they've been used with known health issues for longer than PFAS. So since about the 1st century BC, there were texts that wrote that metals, or lead in particular, have health effects. This is a really interesting plot that I like, and notice it brings back the periodic table, so that was also good too. But it's looking at elements and saying, where do they get lost from the life cycle? Okay? And so on the right, on the top left, you'll see the average lifetime. So for iron, 154 years, it stays in the environment and use. And so that makes sense. You see a steel bridge, they last for a really long time. But the other thing you'll notice is the bar, and the bar on the right says that they get lost mostly during waste management and recycling. And that makes sense too for iron. If you look at arsenic, it's only 2 years, and it's mostly lost for production. So you're wondering why I put that site in Chile with the big mine tailing. That's where there's a lot of arsenic. So you have a lot of arsenic in the production phase, and if we're going to address the problem, we want to look at that production phase. If we look at rare earth elements, we're talking anywhere from about 3 years to 14 years, and it's mixed between losing it from production and losing it from waste management. And that tells us we need to do a better job of recycling, and we need to do a better job of looking at the metals that are released during production. Okay. All right. We also have an ohm, so like other things with the microbiome, we have the metallome, which is basically the complete set of free and bound metals that are associated with the cell. And as you can see from the figure, there's a lot of reactions that take place that metals are involved in. They play a role in signaling, catalysis, gene expression. They play a role in cell structure and also detoxification. So in many ways, they're also very important to us. Okay. Metals are forever and at their forefront. They are at the forefront of social injustice. So this paper by Owens et al. That came out in 2022 started with about looking at 36,000 mines that are geolocated. Okay. From that, they said, okay, they narrowed it down to 20,000 in which there had been investment in, or had been, associated with energy transition metals. And then about 25% of those, or 5,000 of them, had already had investment committed either towards defining the ore body or mining development. And I show you this because that 69% of these energy transition metal projects are on or near land that qualifies as either indigenous peoples' land or peasant land. So that's the yellow, the green, and the blue. Okay? So while you're looking at that, if you don't know what peasant land is, it's really land that's associated with people who either rent or work the land. And in some cases, people will define it based on the fact that indigenous is the people who are on the land, and peasants are the people who work the land. Okay. All right. If we look at particular metals such as lithium, about 87% are in that yellow, blue, and green region representing the indigenous or peasant lands. And then 78% for copper and 68% for the rare earth elements. Okay. Now, metals are forever and they have variable toxicity. So anything from carcinogenicity to neurotoxicity to genotoxicity and reproductive and developmental toxicity. We often group these, and some of the ways we group them are not necessarily based on what toxic effects they have, but actually based on whether they're toxic at all of their concentrations and whether they have known biological functions. Okay? So if you look at, say, cadmium, mercury, and lead, they're pretty much toxic at all concentrations, like we talked about for lead, but they don't really have any known biological functions. If we go to group 3, you'll see they're toxic above a certain concentration and they're essential below. So selenium, for example, is really interesting because it has a very narrow gap between when it's actually good for organisms and when it's actually toxic to organisms. And so that's kind of interesting. And if we go to group 4, which could be potentially toxic at low concentrations, but we don't know a lot about them, we see the rare earth elements showing up there. And to put this in perspective of what's happening is that if you look at a plot of time versus production of rare earth elements, you see this exponential increase in the production of rare earth elements. If you layer on top of that work that was done looking at ecotoxicity studies, you also see a big increase that's occurring in the ecotoxicity studies. But in this review by Malhotra in 2020, what they found was that we don't really know a lot about the toxicity. So more studies are happening. And so what we're saying is we're actually bringing these things up at concentrations higher than we've ever been exposed to them, and we don't know a lot about them. Okay. All right. So this is Lee Blaney. He is the president of AESP this year. He's also a former student of mine. And I figured I should show his face somewhere since this is an AESP lecture talk. So, but Lee was at the Gordon Conference this past spring, as well as some other people, and he was talking about wastewater treatment. He was suggesting that wastewater treatment shouldn't be called wastewater treatment anymore. It should call resource recovery. And how many people are Taylor Swift fans or willing to admit it? There you go. All right, excellent. Well, he had this quote that was, "We're never, ever, ever getting back together with wastewater treatment." So I figured I had to learn from my students. So metals are never, ever, ever going away, but they can be recycled. And right now we're not doing a very good job of it, and we really need to improve that. So, all right. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's a reason to study metals, and that is important to us in terms of understanding their fate and transport and their impacts on health as PFAS. Okay, so that brings me to studying it. Oops, I forgot to animate that, sorry. Actually, I think I forgot to get rid of it. Those are iron oxide particles. So there you go. I'll work it right in there. Okay, so that's iron oxide. We'll be talking a lot about metal oxides, and iron oxide's one of them. That's just for you, Joshua, so they look a lot like iron oxide. Okay, so the reason that I'm interested in looking at absorption processes, which has been the focus of my work, is because they're really crucial. They play a role in controlling mobility, bioavailability, reactivity in many systems. And absorption models can help us. If we have models that describe the absorption process, it will help us to design treatment processes, understand fate and transport, and predict absorption so that we can estimate risk of impact. And typically, there you go. We're going to take the iron oxide particles and we put them in this batch reactor, right? And so my batch reactor is very well defined. I define the solutes very well. I define the pH. I set it maybe to a certain value. I put in the background electrolytes that I'm willing to allow to go in there. Maybe it's only sodium and chloride. And I put in my sorbent that you just saw, the iron oxide. So now the iron oxide's in the beaker. And I can quantify removal macroscopically. And that's what we've been doing for, probably a century now, okay, or longer. But what we also include in that is that we look at what's happening at the surface and in the solution of this, and we start trying to understand the mechanisms. And so by understanding the mechanisms and then defining how we do our experiments, we can learn a lot about what's happening that should allow us to predict transport and process design. And you can see we can come back to our spiral now and say, okay, this is how we look at this. We're going to do some macroscopic assessment, see if our models work, refine the models, do some more analysis. Okay? So I'm going to walk through this for a couple of examples. So how many people are familiar with adsorption isotherms? Okay, so some people are, some people aren't, a lot of people are. So this will be just a brief review for those of you, and hopefully clear enough for people who don't look at this all the time. So here's the iron oxide I just talked about. You can see the particles sitting in their little beaker. And then we're going to look at arsenate adsorption. This is work that was done back in 2012. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in a fixed amount of these solids, and we're going to vary the initial concentration of arsenate and vary the pH. So we get data that sort of looks like it's on different curves for the different pH values, but what you'll notice is it's a nonlinear relationship, okay? And the way we're going to describe it is really it looks what we would call very Langmuirian, okay? And what that means to us is that we have an adsorption, so there's our Goethite surface, and we have site. Whoa, that was way fast. Did everybody get that? And then we have surface sites. So these are the surface sites, these little water molecules or hydroxyl molecules sitting on the surface. And so we've got the iron, the oxygen, and then a hydrogen sitting there, maybe, or maybe not. We may lose that. And we'll call that a surface site. And then what you'll see is then we sorb to it, and the total number of sites is called ST. Well, while we might call these total number of sites, we can also call them the maximum amount that gets adsorbed. So we can convert those units and say this is the maximum amount adsorbed. And for every pH, we have a different amount that got adsorbed. And so the model that is the Langmuir's model is basically saying that the amount that we adsorb, which is our y-axis, so mass of arsenate adsorbed per gram of the solid phase, this is iron oxide coated sand, divided by that maximum adsorption capacity is a function of the equilibrium concentration and an energy term. Okay? Now, in surface complexation modeling, which is what I'm familiar with doing, is we're going to basically take this adsorption process and basically put it into a reaction term. So we take that surface site, we add metal to it, and we form this metal ligand complex on the surface, and it has an equilibrium constant. Okay, so we can take that and we can use the concept of total sites and this reaction, and we can rewrite our isotherm based on the amount that's adsorbed divided by the total number of sites is a function of the metal ion concentration, and our energy term is the equilibrium constant. Okay? So we've related now what we see on surfaces to what we see in aqueous solutions. The other thing you'll notice is that we had a different Q naught for every single pH. Okay? So we can do a different type of experiment where we actually look at our reactor, and now we only vary the pH. So we fix the metal ion concentration, and we plot pH versus the percent adsorbed. Okay? So if we say focus on pH 6, what you'll see is that lead is almost 100% removed at pH 6, and zinc less, and cadmium even less. So in other words, absorption follows that we get more absorption of lead compared to zinc compared to cadmium. But the other thing you'll notice is that it goes up with pH. And what that tells us is that pH, or the proton is involved in this reaction. And so now if we correctly describe our site as a surface hydroxyl group, where you see the oxygen and the hydrogen, we add our metal ion, and we form this metal ion complex, and we release a proton. We have an equilibrium constant, and we can actually predict that equation, that data. Okay? All right. So that's surface complexation modeling in a nutshell. Okay. And there's been a lot of work on this. Zombeck and Morel in the 1990s collected a lot of plots that look just like this, where you see the cation adsorbing and going up, increasing adsorption with increasing pH, and we see something like an oxyanion or metalloid getting decreasing adsorption with increasing pH, so going in the opposite direction. Okay. Now there's a little bit more to this model than I said, because even the surface hydroxyl groups can either lose a proton or gain a proton. Okay? That means we're basically acting like a diprotic acid. So we have two more reactions that basically follow acid-base chemistry that say we can lose a proton once and we can lose a proton a second time. Okay. All right, so they modeled a lot of data. There are hundreds of these graphs in this book, and of different metal ions, different experiments, all from literature that had been collected previous to 1996 when this was done. But the other thing was that if you look at this, they couldn't model all the data without using two different types of sites. So they couldn't say that everything was adsorbing to the same site. They had to put in a second site, which they called weak sites and strong sites. So they published this book in 1990, and it's based on the diffuse layer model. Well, what's the diffuse layer model? Well, if you put a charge on a surface, or charge on anything, you will develop a potential. And so the idea is that if I put cobalt on the surface, say, for example, I'm going to form this metal ligand complex. It has a positive charge. It creates a potential. And I have to have a relationship between the potential and the surface charge. And this one is described by the Goy-Chapman model. Okay? So we're going to refine our model a little bit, too, to say that maybe this is a pretty simplistic representation that they use. We can do more complex representations that says, well, cobalt may absorb on the surface, but strontium may be a water molecule away. So there's a water molecule between the strontium and the surface. Remember, this is just a conceptual model. And when we do that, now we have layers of relationships between charge and potential, and the ones that we look at between what's called the knot plane and the beta plane, or the inner Helmholtz and outer Helmholtz plane, is a single capacitance. So it's like a parallel plate capacitor that you learned about when you took second semester physics or circuits or something. Okay, so the question becomes, though, how do you know what absorbs on the knot plane and what absorbs on the beta plane? What gets a water molecule between it and what doesn't? Well, that's where spectroscopy comes into play. So we're going to basically look at modeling, look at some macroscopic data that was taken a long time ago that I collected with aluminum oxide and cobalt, and aluminum oxide and strontium. Now, if you look on the periodic table, here's cobalt sitting in the middle of the transition metals, and here's strontium sitting in the alkaline earth metal group. And when we look at the cobalt data and we change the ionic strength, so we're not changing the oxide concentration, we're not changing the total metal concentration, but we're changing the background electrolyte, the sodium nitrate. And as we increase it, we see no effect on the adsorption edge. Okay, so people would interpret that as strong binding, but we didn't really know what that meant. But when we put spectroscopy in it, we can start to learn. And if you look at strontium instead, what you'll see is doing the same type of experiment. If we increase the ionic strength, we increase that background electrolyte, we get less adsorption. Okay? That's not predicted by the Zombeck and Morel model. You need that second capacitance layer. You need to be able to move that surface away from it. And the way we know that that's what's happening is the X-ray adsorption spectroscopy was basically used to find the distances between the cobalt and various other elements. And so here we're looking at a distance of 3 to 4 angstroms for that inner sphere complex, and we don't see that distance for the outer sphere complex because there's a water molecule between them. And so from that spectroscopy, we go ahead and we refine the model, and we can say the strontium is on that beta plane and the cobalt is on that inner or not plane, and that's how we distinguish them. So we've just basically done one round in one cycle of our spiral. Okay? The next one that came into play was the fact that not all surfaces bind with one cadmium going to one iron or one metal ion sorbing directly to, through an oxygen to the iron. In some cases, like for zinc, you may have zinc bound to 2 oxygens with a single iron, or in cases like arsenic, you're going to bind to 2 different iron groups. And that came from also doing X-ray absorption spectroscopy, where you can identify what surface complexes actually formed. And so for arsenic, we get this bidentate binuclear process. We rewrite our surface complexation model to account for those 2 surface hydroxyl or iron hydroxyl groups, and we can predict our data again, and we get good fits. So we've refined our model again. Now, I'm not going to go through this because I think you have the idea that we can keep cycling through this, and over the years, people have said not all surface affinities are equal. So in 1996, Heemscher and Van Remsik said, hey, not all surface sites are equal, but we actually knew that because Zambek and Rill had weak and strong sites. Okay? But they created a model called the charge distribution multi-site surface complexation model, or framework, and people have adapted that, including myself. And then Villalobos came along and said, things don't really make sense. We're not getting really good fits to data, and it's because as something like goethite grows, this is a picture of goethite, it's an iron oxide, and when it grows by having things attached to this, so it sort of grows up from that planar surface, and the ratio of these edge sites to these face sites changes. And these are more reactive. So as you grow the crystal, as it comes out, you're going to have differences in reactivity. So we took all of that into account, and just a summary of what we've done with model predictions using the CD music, we've been able to look at impacts of, for alkaline earth sorption metal ions, of magnesium and barium at different ionic strengths, and see differences that we can predict, and even different background electrolytes. So noting the difference between nitrate and chloride, which most people don't even account for that. And then showing that we can actually even predict what happens when we combine them. We've been able to look at competition between different metal ions, and also synergistic interactions when, say, a cation and anion come in and absorb together, so either ion pairing or complexation. And so this work led us to think we now have a model that allows us to understand that, but it's a pretty complex model. And it's not necessarily one you would take out to Lake Coeur d'Alene and say, let's give it a try. We have very little data, but let's go for it. So that takes us to the next part of this talk. And so you can see, you can follow along my talk with the outline at the bottom. And now we're going to talk about Lake Coeur d'Alene. I don't know if you ever saw this picture, but this is, during the time we were doing this work, or just after, there was this big article saying it was the 2nd highest population growth during the pandemic in this region because everybody was hanging out at the beach instead of doing anything else because, I don't know, there's a lot of contact right there, but we won't go into that. Okay. So anyway, in the 1880s, there was a lot of mining that began, and I want to set the stage for you. So the original Aboriginal territory for this is the solid red line. The reservation boundary that was set in 1873 is this dashed line, so you can see it still includes all of the lake, but only part of the river. That's the Lake Coeur d'Alene River right there. So, or not, it's the Coeur d'Alene River right there, going into the lake, and all of that. And now the present reservation is about, half of the lake. Okay? All right, so that's something to think about. But over the 100 years, and then the other thing I'll say is that the mine Kellogg, I want you to sort of focus on this region of Kellogg, and the mining that began right after the territory reservation boundary switched. So they started mining pretty quickly right after that. Now you might wonder why they changed the reservation boundary. But over 75 million metric tons over 100 years were contaminated, and they're sitting in the lake with lead, cadmium, arsenic, and zinc. About 32 million metric tons of contaminated sediments are in the floodplain of the Coeur d'Alene River. And in 1983, this was put on the national priorities list. So here come the health effects. So in 1973, there was a fire in, so remember, we're over here, there's Kellogg, here's Smelterville. This is what became the first operable unit of the Superfund site of this region. And in 1973, there was a fire in the air pollution control system. So the air pollution control system works a lot like a vacuum cleaner, right? Anybody operate a vacuum cleaner that had a bag? Okay, so if the bag breaks, what happens? All the particles go everywhere. Well, lead prices were really high, and the company decided that they didn't want to stop production. So lead levels in 1973 were measured at 67 micrograms per deciliter. Okay, what was the good value? 0. 0. Okay, so now there's a problem. And over the years, when the smelter was closed in 1981, after there was an emergency response to the epidemic, they did lead health studies. They finally started doing some remediation starting in the late 80s, and now we're coming down to reasonable lead levels. Okay? If you look at some of that remediation, I think this is kind of a nice example of just seeing like what this looked like before, and then they basically started trying to prevent some of these contaminated sediments from leaving the site. The average blood lead levels have now come down to about 2 micrograms per deciliter. This is as of May 2024, and this quote from EPA says they're nowhere near complete. I think we would concur. So here's this location again. What was interesting about this is that EPA deferred the remedial action of the lake. And they said, hey, let's let the tribes and the state use the Clean Water Act to either monitor or do something. Okay, remember 75 million metric tons of sediments contaminated. So in 2009, they developed this lake management plan. And the idea behind the lake management plan was basically to stop nutrients going in, because what they were concerned about is down at the bottom of the lake, what if it goes anoxic? If it goes anoxic, will the metals be released? And that was basically the focus of the sediment work I'm going to talk about in a minute. Well, the tribe went along with it for about 10 years and then retracted their support, and they asked EPA to do something, and that's how Bill and I got involved in this. The 2022 study that was on the future of water quality in Lake Coeur d'Alene was to try and look at these long-term risks. Okay. All right, so let's get situated, okay? Here's the lake. Remember I said the southern portion is controlled by the tribe, and I want to point out this location HP, which is Harlow Point, and Harrison at C5, which is a monitoring point. And we're going to look just first at some manganese, just to sort of set the stage for what is going down, happening at the sediment water interface. So you can see in that location, you'll see in the summer, we're getting lake stratification, and the oxygen concentration is dropping. And as the oxygen concentration drops, the manganese concentration goes up in the water column. And that's because what's happening is when it's oxidized, it's in a solid form, and as the redox reactions occur and we reduce the manganese, it becomes released and during the stratification period. Okay? All right. Let's also look at some natural background concentrations of sediments for this region, from arsenic, cadmium, lead, and zinc. And you can see in millimoles per kilogram, we're going from about 0.07 to about less than 2 millimoles per kilogram. And if we look at some monitoring that was done at Harlow Point, you can see that the arsenic, cadmium, lead, and zinc are much higher than, more than an order of magnitude higher than what we see for the background. But look at the iron. It's gigantic, right? So iron is really high. And notice that the iron is also a lot more than the sulfur. And that will play a role as I talk a little bit further. Okay. All right. So the question's going to be, oh my gosh. Okay, there we go. That I want to remind you that cations will desorb at low pH, or in other words, at high pHs, we're going to have low concentrations of the metals. Okay? So our concern would be if the pH goes down. And this is just some experiments that we did in our lab for another project that we were doing a lot more than this, but we just wanted to basically show that if you take iron and it starts to precipitate, in a mixed system, that arsenic-3 will not absorb very much and arsenic-5 will absorb a lot. So redox is important. That's all that is to say. Okay? And I thought I didn't have the iron products forming before, and I figured they should form so you could see them. Okay. So here's that picture I showed you at the beginning. And this is how we started to develop the questions that we wanted to answer through looking at absorption processes. And so here's our iron hydroxide sitting here and here. And we can have absorption and desorption of metals. Okay? If we have conditions where we start to lose oxygen, we can have reductive dissolution of iron-3. And so as we go down, as our oxygen goes down, we'll get iron-3 coming out. And we also will get, if the oxygen goes down, we can get sulfate-reducing bacteria to convert the sulfate to sulfide. And so as we convert that sulfate to sulfide and we produce the iron-2 and other species, we can form sulfide precipitates. Now, the reason I only show iron there is because the sulfide that's going to be generated for sulfate reduction is still going to be a lot less than the total, orders of magnitude less than the amount of iron we have, and much more than the other metals. So we believe that it'll be dominated by the iron sulfide minerals. Okay? All right. So what we wanted to do was basically then say, ask the question, what alterations to the lake chemistry will promote iron-3 reduction? And what will happen if we acidify that pore water, and when will that happen? Okay. So we said we were going to look at desorption, so here it is. So I'm not applying that very, very complex model. I'm applying that diffuse layer model. Remember the one that had the book with all the graphs in it. And this dashed line is the original model that was proposed in that book, the Zombeck and Morel book. And they weren't really doing a very good job fitting some lead data. And so we went back and we remodeled this. But this time, we used the information that we learned from that complex modeling and from the spectroscopy to say that we need to include bidentate reactions. And when we did that and then updated the specific surface area based on newer knowledge of that, we can get a much better fit. So now we have a model. We're going to take it out for a spin. So we're going to take this ideas of all the things that we've learned and see how it can do. So the first thing we did is we looked at some data that were done in batch experiments in our lab and said, okay, let's look at whether it can predict some of these absorption isotherms and also can predict bisolute interactions. So we were able to predict cadmium, cadmium and zinc, cadmium and lead, copper and lead, lead and copper, zinc and cadmium. Okay? So I'd say those are reasonable fits, and so we felt like we're ready to see. So we looked at our data relative to some work that was done back in 2007, and the two data points we have are located here and here for zinc and lead, and we're plotting again pH now, but a function of dissolved concentration. And remember, the dissolved concentration goes down with pH. So we're doing really well with zinc. It looks like we're not doing quite as well with the lead, but I should point out that we're talking about the difference between 1 and 10 micrograms per liter. And so I think we're doing pretty well. And so from that, we were able to actually say, okay, what do we expect to happen? We expect cadmium absorption to be reduced in the presence of zinc or lead, and we expect there to be some competition between the zinc and the lead, given the conditions of the system. Okay, so that led to us basically coming up with our idea of what we believe is happening in the system. So if we have a limited oxygen supply during lake stratification, okay, then we could also have respiration. And if we have respiration that's depleting that O2, we could get some microbial production of CO2. And if that happens, we're going to lower the pH. Okay? If that happens, we're going to acidify these waters, and we're going to get release of the zinc and the cadmium. If we get complete oxygen depletion down there, so now we're very low oxygen, we're going to get conversion of the arsenic-5 to arsenic-3. And remember, arsenic-3 doesn't desorb as well, so we're going to get release of the arsenic under those conditions. But in this case, if we have this dissimilatory reduction, we'll get increases in pH. So the increase in pH will actually mean that we're not going to get release of those other metal ions. So this allowed us to go and say, this is what we believe will happen, and now the tribe and the state can get together and say, okay, these are the things we have to worry about, and these are the things we don't, and they can start planning and designing. Okay, so what's next? Next, I'm going to switch over to looking at the membrane portion. And here I'm going to basically focus on mining issues that are a little more current in terms of what people are concerned about. So I'm going to focus on some lithium mining to start out with. And lithium can be extracted either from brines or from ore. But in either case, you see that they can be very water intensive and they can produce pretty bad wastewaters. Okay? So both of these have issues. So for example, the most common way of dealing with the brines is basically to create solar evaporation ponds. And here's one that you can actually see from satellites. They're very large, and there's a lot of concern from the indigenous communities around them because they're basically using up all the groundwater and water, and so they're worried about their culture. When we look at the ores, we talked about that a little bit in terms of the wastewater generation. You're using strong acids and alkalis. You can see the type of destruction you can see on the biodiversity. The communities are concerned about displacement, and they're also worried about the fact that people will start doing illegal mining in these regions as well. So all of these have concerns, and the thought is, can we do better with other things? But before we do that, I want to take us a little bit closer to home. How many people know about the Thacker Pass mine? Yeah, not too many people. So this is pretty an interesting situation. It's in Nevada, and it's one of it is the biggest lithium reserve in the U.S. So it's where there's been a lot of interest in development. GM and Lithium Americas have been involved in trying to get this going. It's also near ancestral lands, and they're using shallow open pit mining and putting a processing facility there. So they started in March 2023. This is a figure from the Great Basin Research Watch that they had on their site, so I have no veracity to it, except the Great Basin Research Watch has been basically trying to fight this mine for years. And this basically is the map of where they're going to have a lot of loss, draw down in the wells, and those I mean, not in the wells, in the water table. And that water table is also used for their agricultural purposes around there as well. So they have a lot of concerns as well. In 2000, whoa, I lost my, in 2024, last March or February, the Biden administration agreed to give the companies a $2.26 billion conditional loan to try and get this thing finished. It's already started construction by 2028. Okay. So we'd like to think that there's better ways of dealing with lithium than using mines or doing processing through strong acids and strong bases that create a lot of waste. So we wanted to look at membranes. And the idea was, can we trap lithium in a 12 crown 4 ether complex that's attached to a membrane? So the first thing we did was some modeling. So we did computational analysis. And I actually didn't do this work. I'm the associate director of the Center for Materials Water. And the group of us decided to work on this project. It was folks out at UCSB who did a lot of this work and some of the modeling back at UT from Venkik and Essen's group. And so what they showed basically is that if you build this membrane and you put sodium and lithium in it, the sodium will lose its waters of hydration and fit into those shells, whereas the lithium won't. Okay? That means that when you do macroscopic studies, you can actually see that if we plot permeability versus the permeability selectivity, in other words, we're getting nice selective selection of lithium over the sodium, so we're getting separation and we're getting a lot of flow going through. So we're getting both separation and flow going through, and we've improved the ability to separate lithium from sodium. So this idea is really interesting. I'm going to not focus too much on this except for this next slide because I want to talk about ion exchange materials. And the reason I do is because if you look at an ion exchange material, now what you're doing is taking a membrane and you're putting either a cation or a negatively charged functional group like sulfonate for a cation exchange membrane or a positively charged group for an anion. So this is a cation exchange membrane, and what will happen is the sodium will come and electrostatically bind to these sites in the membrane. Because remember, there's a relationship between charge and potential, we've created a charge issue at the membrane surface, and as a result of that, we're going to have a potential that's called the Donin potential. Okay, so if we take one of these cation exchange membranes and put it with an anion exchange membrane, and we put a cathode and anode on each side, and we can get separation of the cations on one side heading to the cathode and the anions heading to the anode, and so we'll have a nice dilute system in the middle and then a concentrate stream. And if we stack these up together, that's called electrodialysis. So we have an electrodialysis system now that can separate the cations and anions, so forth. So I'm interested in that system, but it turns out that somebody took this idea that our group had looking at these 12 crown floor complexes, put it on a cation exchange membrane, and was able to show that you can actually now separate lithium from both sodium and magnesium, and now this is going to pilot scale. So again, we're coming out of that region and saying we can do this type of thing. We can improve selectivity with these membranes. But I said I was interested in absorption, so I'm going to look at the absorption of these systems. So this is the model that's used to describe absorption in these systems. It's called the Donin model. That gives you that potential charge relationship. And the Manning model really deals with the activity coefficient inside the membrane. I'm not going to get into it, just to show you that this is like an isotherm where we have the salt concentration on the x-axis and the absorption into that mobile water inside the membrane on the y-axis. And the model looks like it fits really well. If I change from sodium chloride to sulfuric acid or magnesium sulfate, what you'll notice is we're not fitting very well at all. So this is the part where we say, okay, we're doing our model assessment, it doesn't work, what do we have to do? And when the students came to me and said, look, hey, this isn't fitting, I said, well, it looks like you probably have ion pairing going on. And so what we had to do is figure out how to deal with that. So we were trying to find out, are the ions sitting basically as solvated ions, or are they paired? Now, they could be paired and neutral like this one, or they could even be charged if you had sodium and a sulfate together. Okay. But what we needed to determine was this fraction, right? How much is paired? So we used ionic conductivity to get the charged ions and pulse field gradient NMR to get the, all of the ions. And by using those two values, we could actually calculate the fraction that's paired. And when we incorporate that back into the model, we do really well for the sodium chloride. That shouldn't have been touched, good news. But for the magnesium sulfate, it looks like we're doing a little bit better. But for sodium sulfate and sulfuric acid, we're doing even better. So we've definitely improved the model by incorporating these ion pairs, but it's not quite that simple because there's always more complexity, right? Because not all ion pairs are the same. So you can have different types of ion pairs. You can have contact ion pairs where there's no water between it. But just like with the surface of the oxide mineral, there can be a water between the cation and the anion. And if there is, we call it a solvent shared ion pair. If there's multiple water or a couple of waters in between, we call it solvent separated ion pair. And then you have a solvent. Well, we wanted to see whether that was, that would end up improving our magnesium sulfate fits. So what we did was, and I'm not going to get to that part, but we used Raman spectroscopy and dielectric spectroscopy. Now, Raman spectroscopy can get us these contact ion pairs. It can't get us the others because we can't resolve it within this peak. Dielectric spectroscopy can get us the solvent shared ion pairs, the solvent separated ion pairs, and sometimes the contact ion pairs, but not always, because they get buried in this water peak over here. Okay? So that's our spectroscopic analysis. Now what I'm going to show you is some quick results of that for monovalent, divalent, and trivalent cations. And what you'll see here is this is for lithium sulfate. The dielectric spectroscopy shows that we have both solvent shared and solvent separated ion pairs. Raman spectroscopy shows that we also have contact ion pairs. And if we do the same thing for for sodium that we do for lithium, and you say it looks almost the same. If we bring potassium in there, you'll see there's less solvent shared and solvent separated ion pairs, but there's a lot more contact ion pairing. And so we think this is due to the higher polarizability of the lithium. If we move to divalent cations, we see similar results. But in this case, it was really nice because we could get the contact ion pairs from dielectric spectroscopy and also from Raman. And you can see we're getting pretty similar results between the two. So when we look at the relative concentration, we're between 10 and about 13, 14% in both cases. And so we're getting pretty good results for both. And then if we go to trivalence, we looked at both lanthanum sulfate and neodymium sulfate. And you can see now we're getting 30, 40% contact ion pairs. That's pretty significant. So as we start thinking about separating rare earth elements in these membranes, we should be pretty careful to make sure we incorporate this. And just to show you that we're really not interested in looking at necessarily what's happening in the water, we really want to know what's happening in the membrane. We can't really get in the membrane. So what we did was we took a property of the membrane that's important, which is dielectric constant. So by adding methanol to the water, we can reduce the dielectric constant. So we started with the data that we had at 0 methanol, and we increased the methanol mole fraction for both the solvent shared ion pairs and the contact ion pairs. And you can see the trends are different in both, and the dielectric, the contact ion pairs show that potassium sulfate has a much higher fraction. Okay? So we didn't see much change so much in the solvent shared ion pairs, but definitely in the contact ion pairs, and the trends are different. And when we applied this to looking at just membrane Zorpin data, going back to these equilibrium concentrations versus the salt solubility, you'll see that we see the same trends, lithium up to potassium. So what we're seeing in the membrane seems to mimic what we're seeing in solution by adding the methanol, which is what we had hoped. And if we calculate the constants for the neodymium and lanthanum, you can see that the binding constants for the ion pairing goes up in the presence of methanol. So what that tells us is that we think these processes can be important in membranes and should be considered. All right, so that brings me to the end, and I'm going to wrap up right now. And what I'm going to say is this. I've done all this work. I've showed you all this detail of work that's been done over years. And it's included a lot of microscopic work, a lot of modeling, so forth. When I started looking at this over the summer, I said, I want to see how much AI work's been done with adsorption just of heavy metals. And 50 articles. And one of them was on acid mine drainage, looking at copper and an adsorbent. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I started thinking, well, where should we be going? What should be the future? What should it look like? And so I read some review articles and talked to a lot of people about, what the drawbacks are. And some of the drawbacks are pretty obvious, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity. There's variability in training sets. There's bias due to how we weight things. You can get to a local optimum. Of course, you can do that in modeling too. But more importantly is that we don't really deal with the fact that we have mechanistic understanding of things. And how do we incorporate that mechanistic understanding into AI? And I think that's our challenge. I think we really need to be able to combine these tools to be able to do predictive modeling, because as we look at the complexity of environmental systems, especially as we're working with waters that have a lot more complexity than we ever used to deal with, we really need to be thinking about how we can improve our ability. So as we end, I'd say the questions that come to me at the end of this is, have we done enough? Have we sufficiently captured mechanisms to predict sorption in complex systems, especially as we look at these alternative waters? And what's missing from AI? And can we, and are we, and I believe we are, starting to figure out ways to integrate fundamental physics and chemistry and microbiology into models that will help us guide the AI process so that we can eventually do a much better job of predicting and hopefully get to the point where we use all of this technology and understanding to do more metal ion recycling. And with that, I acknowledge all of the colleagues and students who've worked on this project over the years, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And do you have any questions?
Ask the really nerdy one.
Okay.
So I noticed in a lot of the experiments, the background salt concentration was really high, right? So molar, sodium nitrate, things like that. I just wonder how you deal with activity, or activity coefficients.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because we're just about to finish a paper looking at So here's the interesting thing, right? So this is going to be a really nerdy answer. So the Manning model is how people have looked at it for membranes, and I won't get into that because I think it's not that great. But one of the things that's been bothering me is that, when we go to high ion strength, the model that people typically apply for activity coefficients is the Pitzer model. Now here's the problem with the Pitzer model and what we're doing to refine it, okay? So the problem with the Pitzer model is this. It deals with, at high ionic strength, it deals with interactions between binary interactions or ternary interactions. It deals with all that. But it doesn't identify these as species, okay? It just says we have these interactions. Well, the problem with that is if you're going into a membrane that's charged, charge is important. It's not just the interaction, it's the charge that's going to dictate. So the Pitzer model can go up to these ionic strengths. So what we're doing, and we've done this we've done this, but we haven't published it yet, is that we modify the Pitzer model to incorporate ion pairing. So we actually now can give you an activity coefficient for an ion paired species that isn't just really coming from nowhere. So it's based on, going back to the original osmotic coefficient data for these salts and reevaluating all the way back from there to get an activity coefficient that recognizes that there's potentially 2 or 3 species in there, not just the ion, but the ion pair, or maybe 2 different ion pairs. So that's what we're doing to try and address that.
Thanks.
Was that too nerdy?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. All right, what are the graduate? Thank you. Oh, wait, graduates. I thought I saw a graduate student hand go back up. There you go.
I think doing these advanced, coming up with these advanced models that take account into advanced, interaction parameters is really great. But when you're doing the model fitting, is it just macroscopic experiments fitting the data to a set of fitting the data to a model and coming up with the model parameters, or could you do
No.
independent characterization to come up with the model parameters?
Yeah, so the whole idea and the growth in this that obviously I couldn't go into during this talk is to find ways to come up with independent parameters. So let's just take the simplest model. The simplest model being that Zombeck and Morel model. The fitting parameters are the binding constant for every metal surface interaction, and then the 2 acidity constants. So people are doing work now to actually determine the acidic constants from molecular simulations using, molecular dynamics or whatever. So we can get those constants from there. Sometimes they're not so great. Sometimes we have to think about, what's realistic. So you still have to put some. Sometimes you'll get a value for a pK of 13 something, which isn't going to help you at all. Not going to make any difference. But we can do that. And then for the other issue, and this is one we've worked, is how do you deal with the changing surface site densities that you have and the differences in those surface site densities as a crystal has different images. So what we've done is basically use the surface area of the particle, so an independent measure of the surface area, and then how it grows to calibrate what that relationship is between the surface area of the particles and the distribution of those faces. So another independent measure. In all of our systems, one of the reasons we do a lot of bisolute macroscopic data is because what we found is it's pretty easy to fit these data because the number of parameters, like for the triple layer models, there's 7 parameters before you get started. You have to get that interlayer capacitance. So people are doing stuff looking at how, quantitative measurements of how you get the capacitance value. So all these things people are looking at ways to determine independently. And so, and if they're not determined independently through different techniques, microscopic or computational, then the other thing you can do is, design your macroscopic experiments so that they work in ranges far away from, so you're predicting data far away from where you are and you're testing the model that way. But there's a lot of independent model parameter termination, and people have been working on that for about 20 years. Yeah, really great question. Awesome question.
Okay, I have a question. Fortunately, Bill asked my first one. Pitzer was triple underlined in my notes. But okay, so I'm going to take a step back and kind of go back to Coeur d'Alene and I'm thinking about whether or not those lands are ceded territory lands and how your collaboration with tribes is going to protect their ceded territory rights, especially for thinking about I don't know what their specific rights are, but I'm assuming it has to hunt, gather, fish, and do other things like it is in Minnesota. And so do you work with the tribes on these ceded territory rights?
Yeah, so we're not working with them now,
Okay.
but during the study that we were involved in, they were in every meeting with, that we had associated with it, and they do collect their own data, and so we use both their data and data that the state had collected and other researchers. So there's a lot of data. They're still collecting a lot of data. One of the big things that they were concerned about was phosphorus, right? So the big concern was phosphorus is all this development. We're going to have more phosphorus going into the lake. The more phosphorus in the lake that's not being caused by the tribes is going to affect the tribes because during the stratification, you're going to get a lot of organic matter coming down to the bottom, so you're going to have a lot more opportunity to basically get that system anoxic and will it release. And so a large portion of the project dealt with the phosphorus data and whether the data suggested that there was going to be an increase in issues with phosphorus. And most of what we saw, and Bill can correct me if he thinks I'm wrong, but or not quite so right, that a lot of that if that happened, it would probably be near shore, right? But the tribe, has made, in terms of the limited amount of work I've done with tribal interactions, they were really engaged and vocal, and so we listened. When we had, they used to have like full day public hearings, and they were their presentations were as dominant as the Idaho State presentations, and
Their data was better too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I think they're being heard there. I don't think there's a whole lot. Keep in mind there's still loads coming in. So if you look at the zinc data, for example, I think zinc in the water column is about 60 micrograms per liter. Does that sound about right to you? About 60 micrograms per liter, but it fluctuates, and mostly in the northern part, that fluctuation is due to loads coming in, and so it's related to the hydrology of what's happening, by the river. And so they still have contamination coming in, which is why EPA says they're not nearly done, because there's still all these sediments that are located, right near the outfall into the lake that are still bringing stuff in. So it's a really tough problem because it's not clear what you can possibly do. But what they do need, and what the tribe, does advocate for, I don't know what's going to happen now, but it's been monitoring, right? The big thing they need to do monitoring, because all the things that we said, this is what could happen, you're not going to know unless you monitor pretty closely. Did that answer your question? Probably not as well as you'd like.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just a quick question about the manganese data. I was a little surprised to see the increases in manganese concentrations in the bottom water when you still had quite a bit of dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, it does drop down quite a bit. Yeah, no, I actually 100% agree. It's not down to like 2, but it's, we actually even saw, I think in some of the data there was even some arsenic release. I couldn't find that data again when I went to look through the report, but I think we even saw regions where, they were getting, do you remember that, Bill? So I think when we looked a little bit, there was, so I do think that they're getting, it's probably pockets, right? And I think that may have been near shore data too. So it could be, well, I don't know if it was near shore. I have to go back and look and see that. I don't remember now that I think about it.
And it also could be a kinetic thing in the sense that if you have actual anoxic layers where the manganese is being reduced, And the pH there is probably, what, 7 or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, very close to 7. Because if they get to 6, they're going to release a lot from the iron.
And so it's not going to be reoxidized even if oxygen is present
Right.
very quickly.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, absolutely. I'm working at my Alaska talk. We're trying to remove manganese, and they have issues with kinetics there too with the manganese. But you're absolutely, of course, correct. Yeah. One more student. Then they could, if we have time, hopefully.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could talk more about the current state of metal recycling and where the metals are coming from, and if it's mainly from wastewater or if there's other types of materials that people are focused on recycling metals
Not a
from.
lot of recycling, but there's a lot of people starting up. So there's a lot of things are starting up for looking at metal recycling, and there's a few companies that are doing it, but not to. I mean, the volume is just nowhere near close. But it's definitely happening. There's definitely both technologies that are out there and technologies development to be developed. ARPA-E, which is a Department of Energy funding group, they're basically, they have a call out now to just start looking at critical mineral recovery just from waste streams and other things first. And so there's two efforts going on. One is associated with the waste streams and one is associated with recovery from the materials. But the recovery from the materials is tough because you've got, you think about a lithium battery and you crack it open, there's a lot of stuff there, right? So how do you even get to it in the process? So there's a lot of processing done, whereas if you start with a waste stream, it's a little bit easier to get to, okay, what technologies can I use for separation? But it's happening, so yeah. I'm not sure what will happen in the next few years, though. Hey, thank you. You guys were awesome. Thanks for the great questions. I really appreciate this opportunity. This was really fun, and it was great to share. So thanks for listening.